I would like to welcome Laurence to us, and I'm very interested to hear what he has to say, and I'm sure you will be too. So, Dr. Laurence Geary.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've been in this absolutely wonderful resource. I'm very impressed by it. And I'd like to thank Mary and John for making it possible. Thank you. Okay, my task this evening is to offer an account of pre-famine Irish life, referring to Tipperary and using supporting evidence from Tipperary wherever I can. Much of the evidence I've got in relation to Tipperary comes from an 1820 report, which has been rarely used by historians. In 1820, the government set up a General Board of Health, and its main function was to improve public health generally. Now, this followed on from a major fever outbreak that took place following the ending of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. And this outbreak went on through 1816, 17 and 18 into early 1819. And it's estimated during this period that up to 1.5 million Irish people contracted fever, which essentially is typhus fever, and that somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people died. So in the wake of this then, the government set up this Board of Health. And one of the board's first tasks was to secularise what they called intelligent individuals throughout the country. And these included members of Parliament, the clergy of different denominations, magistrates, governors of hospitals and dispensaries. And essentially they were approaching these people to get information on the health of the people and what their general living conditions were like. And they asked a whole series of questions about housing, about health, about employment, poverty, types of diseases that reigned, and so on. Now, the response was so great that the board only published information relating to Munster. And as I say, my Tipperary references are derived largely from this report. If anybody wants the reference later on, I'd be happy to provide it to them. Now, I'd like to begin with one of the findings of the Devon Commission. And the Devon Commission was a parliamentary inquiry that was established by the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, in 1843. And what it was doing was examining the relationship between landlords and tenants in Ireland. And this inquiry reported in February of 1845, just a few months before the Great Famine began. So it's an outstanding picture, if you like, of what life was like in Ireland, what relations between landlords and tenants were like in the months immediately preceding the Great Famine. So we notice with deep regret the state of the labourers and the cottiers in most parts of the country from want of certain employment. And certain here refers to regular or constant employment. In many districts, their sole food is the potato, their only beverage is water, their cabins are seldom a protection against the weather, that a bed or a blanket is a rare luxury, and that in nearly every case, their pig and manure heap constitute their only property. Now, this really encapsulates all I want to say this evening. I think we can all go home now, because essentially what I'll be doing is just simply elaborating on these basic points. The latter bit is quite interesting, that the pig and manure heap constitute their only property. The idea of a manure heap being the property of people, I think, really indicates how impoverished people were at this period. And this is not a derogatory comment. This is a reality. And I'll return to this point later on, this manure heap as property and its function in the pre-famine period. Now, similar observations and sentiments to this one can be found in virtually every contemporary account of Irish social conditions in the first half of the 19th century. Travellers' tales and a succession of official and private inquiries highlighted the plight of the country's poor. And the poor at the period might be broadly defined as those who were exclusively or heavily dependent on potatoes for their food. Under this definition, between 1/2 and 2/3 of the pre-famine Irish population were poor. This is a population that had more than trebled in the previous century, from approximately 2.5 million people in 1750 to about 8.5 million people in 1845, the year in which the Great Famine began. And by this time, Tipperary had a population of some 400,000 in the region. My first reference from this 1820 report I mentioned a few moments ago is to Lady Glendall of Care. Now she stated, and I quote, "The inhabitants are so numerous that they are eating each other up." Current thinking is that the Irish population grew from somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million in the wake of a disastrous famine that occurred in the early 1740s to about 4 million in 1790 and 5 million in 1800. Now, if you think about it, in that decade, the 1790s, the decade of the 1798 rebellion, the population grew by 1 million. That's by 25% in a decade alone. And this indicates how rapidly the Irish population was growing. The first successful Irish census was in 1821, and this gave us a figure of about 7 million people. Now, the population rose more slowly after this, but it reached about 8.2 million in the 1841 census and about 8.5 million by the time the Great Famine began. These estimates suggest that Irish population growth was unusually fast by European standards in the second half of the 18th century, but that the increase was less rapid after 1821, and that it was closer to the normal European pattern. So in other words, after the ending of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the Irish population was still increasing, but at a decelerating rate. Now, this population was overwhelmingly rural. In the pre-famine period, 85% of the Irish population lived in the countryside, many of them dependent on subsistence farming for their survival. Ireland, unlike Britain, did not experience an industrial revolution. There were exceptions, notably in northeast Ulster, in Dublin, in Cork, and some of the other cities. Ireland's economy throughout this period remained largely an agricultural one, catering for its own growing population and for the rapidly increasing British market. As Britain became increasingly industrialised and urbanised in the 18th century and subsequently, there was an increased demand for Irish food products, a demand that was further stimulated by the Napoleonic Wars. The increasing British dependency on Irish food exports during this period benefited a large minority of the Irish population, specifically landowners, large and middling farmers, and merchants. Now, for this group, these middle class and upper class people, these were prosperous years. But for the mass of the population, the small farmers, the labourers, the cottiers, the evidence suggests that the pre-famine half-century was a period of misery, impoverishment, and steadily deteriorating living conditions and standards. While the living standards of the middle and upper classes improved, the situation of the Irish poor deteriorated significantly, particularly with the onset of a severe economic recession after the ending of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So the second half of the 18th century was a boom period, if you like, period of prosperity for the better off, the larger farmers, the landowners, and so on. But for all others, it was a period of immiseration. And then at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, a major economic crisis set in, not only in Ireland, but throughout much of Europe. And this really added to the impoverished nature of Irish society for the lower classes. Now, there are several indicators of poverty Excuse me. There are several indicators of poverty and the appalling living conditions endured by the Irish poor in the first half of the 19th century. And perhaps the most important are housing and diet. The 1841 census identified 4 types or classes of housing, which were graded according to size and quality. The lowest category of housing was 4th class. Now, 4th class housing was essentially a one-roomed cabin or tenement. And the census, that is the 1841 census, reveals that more than 40% of the Irish population occupied this category. So 40% of the Irish people in 1841 lived in this 4th class housing, that is one-roomed cabins. Another 40% occupied homes that were more spacious and perhaps in marginally better condition. But in general, the structures that housed the bulk of the Irish population, some 80% of it, were badly built, with poor lighting and poor ventilation. The cabins of the poor were often cold and without comfort, and they were invariably overcrowded because of their small size and the large families who resided in them. Furniture and clothing were rudimentary. There was a general shortage of bed clothing, and as a result, family members invariably huddled together in the same bed for warmth. So the entire family more or less sleeping together. And they didn't sleep in beds as we do. The beds consisted of straw at best, and very often people had to sleep on the bare ground. Domestic and farm animals were often kept inside these family homes. Now, these cramped, substandard homes made domestic and personal hygiene all but impossible, and such living conditions had clear implications for the health and the well-being of the people. In County Tipperary, the floors of cabins were often below the level of the ground, as a result of the earth being dug out to form the walls of the house. Now, this practice meant that water and other types of effluvia seeped into the floors of the cabin, making the interior damp, uncomfortable and unhealthy. So the interiors were lowered from the ground outside and everything is pouring in. And I'll come back to what's pouring in at a slightly later time. In the 1820 report I mentioned earlier, Lady Glengall, commenting on the housing of the poor in Care and its vicinity, stated, "Their dwellings are, in general, wretched hovels, swarming with children, pigs, vermin and filth, both inside and out. And their inclination, their nature, as well as their poverty, go hand in hand on that score. They have no pride or pleasure in a clean house, for the female, sorry, there's a misprint there, for the female part of the population are not taught cleanliness, which is the great source of this evil." Now, what we do find throughout is that when middle-class people are commenting on the poor and their poverty, it's very condescending, it's very patronising, it's pejorative. And we see it captured here precisely in what Lady Glengall is saying. Now, furthermore, Lady Glengall commented on the prevalence of refuse heaps and dunghills throughout the town of Care. They used to pile them up to the tops of their houses and form cesspools of putrid water before their doors. Now, it was a general custom of the poor to form refuse heaps and deposits of manure outside the doors of their cottages. Manure was essential to fertilise potatoes, which were the chief and in some instances the only food of the poor. And as they seldom had ground to the rear of their dwellings, they were obliged to form the dunghills near the entrance to the cabins. Now, contemporary reports from a number of locations in Tipperary refer to, quote, the great value of manure, end of quote, to the poor. So we're back again onto this concept of manure as property, the great value of manure to the poor, many of whom scavenged and collected it to sell to farmers in spring. Manure heaps near dwellings were a feature of the poorer parts of towns and cities as well as the countryside. In some places, such as Carrick-on-Suir, the collections of manure were kept inside the dwellings. And the poor were greatly indignant at any interference of what they regarded as, quote, their property. So back to this notion. So not only outside the building, but actually kept inside. Now, as you can imagine, some contemporary commentator, believed that these refuse heaps and dunghills that the urban and rural poor kept outside the doors of their cottages indicated a general disregard for the principles of cleanliness and decency. And that, as a result, the Irish were a dirty, backward, and ignorant people. And here we see, if you like, the beginnings of racism. This is a racist portrayal of the Irish people. And you see this type of thing now beginning to crop up in Punch cartoons, for instance. The potato-faced, the potato-headed Irishman, the tattered clothes, the dirty dwellings, the dung heaps, the refuse heaps, and so on. So you can see where it's coming from. However, this was an entirely mistaken interpretation of Irish life and farming practices. As I've mentioned to you already, heavy manuring was essential for a healthy and a productive potato crop, on which the livelihood and indeed the lives of the poor depended. The storage and application of manure as practiced by the pre-famine Irish poor was both an ecological and an economic necessity. So far from being dirty and unkempt and everything else and backward, it was an ecological and an economic necessity. This concept was captured by the Reverend Henry Woodward, rector of Feather in 1820. The heap of manure, he said, is the means on which the poor man often entirely depends to provide his potatoes. So manure is property essential for cultivating potatoes on which the poor depend. And of course this is now very ironic because today these would be regarded as organic practices and this type of produce would be fetching premium prices at farmers' markets and so on. So we've come a long way. Now, the living conditions of the poor attracted much criticism, but it was their diet that was invariably singled out for particular commentary. The traditional food of the Irish, which is based on milk and dairy produce, as you would imagine, was largely determined by the country's climate. Over the centuries, the farming and the higher rural and urban social classes came to enjoy a varied, high-protein diet of milk, oatmeal, wheaten bread, meat, fish, eggs, potatoes, and vegetables. Not very unlike what we enjoy today. Quite a wide range of food. I'm emphasising that this is for the better off sections of society. In contrast, the diet of agricultural labourers, cottiers, and small farmers with less than 20 acres of land, roughly the bottom one-third of the Irish population, gradually contracted to a few staple items. By the opening decade of the 19th century, population and commercial pressures had reduced a substantial section of the Irish population to living on potatoes, oatmeal, milk, and fish. For country people, meat was largely confined to festive occasions such as Christmas and Easter. For the rural population, potatoes were the common food for most of the year, with buttermilk or skimmed milk as the traditional accompaniment. Oatmeal was substituted for potatoes when the potatoes were scarce. And this was the case in midsummer, during the so-called meal months or hungry months, when the year's supply of potatoes was exhausted. And oatmeal was also substituted more seriously when there was any deficiency in the annual potato crop. Now, potatoes fed humans and animals alike, and they were key to the survival for the pre-famine Irish. It is estimated just prior to the famine that some 15 million tonnes of potatoes were produced every year. 7 million of this, 7 million tonnes were consumed by people, 5 million by animals, and the other 3 million then is used for seed, for wastage, and in fact some exports. So 12 million out of 15 million fed people and animals. Now, a daily diet of potatoes and buttermilk may have been monotonous, but it was nutritionally adequate. In fact, it constituted a complete food. So potatoes and milk, perfect food. All they're lacking are vitamins A and D. And vitamin D was got by farmers and agricultural labourers working outdoors. There may not have been much sunshine, but they were outdoors for most of the time. So it's almost a perfect food. There is, of course, a proviso to all of this. Can anybody suggest what the proviso is? It's a perfect food, provided. Precisely. Provided there's enough of it and that there's a constant supply of it as well. And this was not always the case. For instance, between 1816 and 1842, there were 14 partial failures of the potato crop. That's once every 2 years. Also, annually, I've mentioned already about the meal months or the hungry months. In midsummer, when potatoes run out and before the next crop is ready for digging. The same with milk. Cows don't produce milk 12 months of the year. There's a dry period. And during this dry period, the drink that people resorted to was water. And water has no nutritional qualities whatsoever. Okay, so milk and potatoes, perfect diet provided there's enough and a constant supply. What about the quantity? If people were hugely dependent on potatoes, and if potatoes and milk was their sole food, potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for dinner, 3 meals a day, if they were lucky. Very often it was only 2, but you were doing well if you got 3. How many potatoes a day are people consuming? Any suggestions? How many? I presume we're mostly potato eaters here, unashamedly, own up to it. And you might have 2 or 3. 20? Any advance on 20? There's always one. Okay, it's been estimated that the average consumption by adult male labourers, and that is labourers over the age of 15, was somewhere between 4.5 and 6.4 kilograms per day. That's between 10 and 14 pounds for those of you who are still back in the troglodyte age. So 4.5 to 6.5 kilograms. And that adult females and children consume proportionally less than this amount. Now, a colleague of mine who had nothing better to do with his time calculated that 6.4 kilograms or 14 pounds consists of between 50 and 80 potatoes a day, and that's your size coming out. Between 50 and 80 a day. And that over a 50-year period, this would amount to 1 million potatoes. Don't shoot the messenger. Now, numerous commentators in the 18th and early 19th centuries noted the health and the happiness of the Irish poor. They may have been living in appalling conditions, but the general impression was that they were happy and that they were healthy. And these commentators attributed this health and happiness to the milk and potato diet. On this simple diet, according to one commentator, William Wilde, who was a major commentator on Irish people throughout this period. So on this diet, according to Wilde, quote, the men were vigorous, the women hearty and handsome, and the children pretty and abundant. He continued in similar vein, heaping inordinate praise on the nurturing and the social qualities of the potato. When kitchened with point, and I'll come back to this in a moment, mollified with milk, it's a fabulous phrase. When kitchened with point, mollified with milk, or softened by a drop of the crater, the like of the potato will never again be found for, quote, rent-paying, pig-feeding, love-making, child-breeding, faction-fighting, and country dancing. As I say, I'll come back to those in a moment, but first I want to tell you what kitchen was and what point was. Kitchen was to add flavouring or relish to food. Okay? Point, well, you can read it there for yourself, I haven't got it here in front of me. Anything that was used for that purpose could be salt or could be pepper, but point referred more particularly to the head of a salted herring that was bruised or mashed into the bottom of some vessel. And then the dried potatoes were dipped into this mixture for flavouring. Okay? Any comment or question on that?
Did they not have some kind of bread as well? They had porridge oats.
They had porridge oats.
So wouldn't that have made some kind of heavy bread?
There's no real reference to the poor people. Middle classes did. But for the poor, it was essentially potatoes, and when potatoes were not available, then it was oatmeal.
You can make potato bread, isn't it, out of oats and potatoes, and sometimes that hasn't come down in this way.
Well, you've got to think of the conditions in which these people were living. Basically, they had a fire and a pot.
Yeah, you don't, that's
And that's it. That's it. Okay, I'm going to be the historian.
Because, that's a staple as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, it wasn't here. It was potatoes and milk, as I was saying. Okay, I want to go back again to what Wilde was saying, and just to see, is he being completely extravagant about this? Rent paying, pig feeding. Anything in that? The pig paid the rent, and potatoes fed the pig. So potatoes fed the pig, which is then sold off at the end of the year to bring in money, which is probably the only cash income that most of these people had, and this was used then to pay whatever rent. Love making and child breeding, I'll leave that to your own imagination.
This is, strikes me as a landlord-centred point of view, which no doubt will now go full circle because the country is now being taken over once again by new landlord class.
I'm not going there. Wilde actually, it's not a landlord perspective. Wilde was a medical doctor. He was also an antiquarian, Irish speaker. So he's not really coming from a landlord perspective. What he is doing is he's recording the folklore of the country. He was an archaeologist as well. And when he wrote this, incidentally, it was in 1854. And I think the date is significant because it comes just a couple of years after the famine had ended. And he's looking back in a very nostalgic way. The potato has failed us, it's gone. We're never going to see its likes again. So it's not a landlord perspective, it's, if you like, a nostalgic look back at what he might have regarded more as a fairly halcyon time.
Faction fighting would involve having a very good supper.
A very strong skin, I would have thought. But faction fighting and country dancing, again, it just suggests energy. So it's providing all of the energy and so on, this life force, if you like, of the people. And the potato, in fact, was the life force of the people. Now, I must say that other commentators held the opposite view. They regarded potatoes as the curse of the country, that are completely destructive to Irish society. And why was this? Because basically they perceived the potatoes that you put them down in spring, you buggered off for the summer, came back in autumn, dug them up and ate them. And again, it's this pejorative way of looking at it, but that was a perspective at the time. And these commentators were suggesting that the potatoes made the Irish people lazy and feckless and backward. Okay, so two very opposing views on the potato. Regardless of these opposing views, what we can say is that the quality of the Irish peasant diet deteriorated in the first half of the 19th century. And this may have been partly due to the substitution of inferior but higher yielding brands of potatoes for traditional ones. And the main culprit here appears to have been the lumper potato, sometimes called the horse potato. And the lumper potato had been introduced from Scotland at the beginning of the 19th century. And there are many references in my 1820 report from Tipperary describing it as a soft, watery type of predator. And watery is the word that crops up again and again in describing this lumper predator. Despite this, it was reliable, it produced high yields, it required very little manure, and it could be grown on marginal and inferior land. And this was very, very important at the beginning of the 19th century, the opening days of Amazon. As the population was exploding, it was increasing massively. So more land was required to grow more potatoes to feed the growing population. So the fact then that they could be grown on the poorest of soil made the lumpers the option of many people. In other words, the lumper potato represented quantity over quality. And its proliferation in the pre-famine period in Tipperary and elsewhere in Ireland reflected increased population and food supply pressures and deteriorating living standards among the poor. The acquisition of life's necessities, which at the most basic level is food, clothing and shelter, generally presupposes that a person has access to land or to money or to employment. The first two, land and money, were in short supply to the vast bulk of the pre-famine Irish, while employment was generally limited and temporary. And this resulted in annual season migration from the poorer to the richer parts of Ireland, from the west of Ireland to the east of Ireland, or on to England and Scotland for potato picking and harvest work. In times of difficulty and shortages, people resorted to a variety of strategies in order to survive, including migration or emigration, begging, private charity, and public assistance or social welfare, as we would now call it. Now, immigration was insignificant in the 18th century, but it became increasingly important from the second quarter of the 19th century onwards, when as many as 1.5 million Irish people left the country in the 30 years leading up to the Great Famine. We often think that mass emigration commences with the Great Famine. This is not true. Mass immigration had preceded the famine by at least 30 years. Can anybody suggest what was the propelling or the motivating factor?
Employment in
No, I'm looking for something specific. It's not employment. Thanks.
It was the increase in population
No.
on the back of...
Industrial Revolution.
It's connected with the Industrial Revolution. And?
It was a change in agricultural policy.
Okay, we'll be going around here in circles all night. It was the steam engine. Steam engines in ships. Up to the first quarter of the 19th century was sail. It took a long time. It was expensive. Whereas steam came in, it was much faster, it was much cheaper. And this produced mass emigration, associated with employment and all of the other parts that you were suggesting. But this is the central propelling factor. Now, those who remained behind depended for their subsistence on their own resources, and very often on the assistance and charity of their neighbours. Now, begging and vagrancy were significant features of Irish social life in the first half of the 19th century. In 1820, the Reverend Henry Woodward, rector of Feathers, commented on the extent of begging in the locality, and he attributed it to a number of causes. What he called general distress. This is coming in 1820, just after the ending of the Napoleonic Wars and a major economic crisis. Indiscreet marriages. Now, I wish he had explained a bit more what he meant by indiscreet marriages. Perhaps people got married too young, or they got married without resources. Also, the removal of the sense of shame attached to begging when it was less frequent. So the more common begging became, the less shame that people tended to feel about it. And shame is a great feature of pre-famine society. No matter how poor individuals were, they had this sense of pride. And to go begging for many of them was a shameful practice. It was an acknowledgement, public acknowledgement, that they were failing, that they couldn't really support themselves. And also the tendency of those whom temporary pressure had forced to beg to continue with the practice. Now, as this latter comment suggests, there were different types of beggars and there were different types of begging. In general, there were two main classes of beggars: professional beggars and also occasional or casual beggars. Now, these casual or occasional beggars were generally forced into the practice by short-term distress. And these individuals attracted sympathy and hospitality. People who just got into a fix for a short-term basis, and they were helped out generally by their neighbours. Now, society then drew a very sharp distinction between these occasional or casual beggars and the professional or the habitual beggars, who were variously known as fair beggars, trading beggars, or bacocks. By the mid-1830s, the term bacock had lost its original meaning of lameness and had become associated with imposture. It was applied to sturdy, wandering beggars who pretended disease or deformity, or who mutilated or impregnated their own children in order to excite compassion. These professional beggars attended markets, fairs, hence fair beggars, also religious festivals or patrons, and they were commonly regarded as importunate, dissolute, and drunken. In 1820, a report from Carrick-on-Suir confirmed that beggars in the town and locality fell into the latter category. They were described as, quote, notorious thieves and impostors, who were well able to support themselves, but they choose to live by begging. It was customary, almost a social obligation, for householders to give at least a handful of potatoes to every beggar who called to the door. And potatoes might be described as the currency of the poor at that time. Considerable quantities of potatoes could be accumulated in the course of a day's begging. And the general practice was to dispose of the surplus to hucksters in exchange for tobacco, snuff, soap, salt, herrings, and cheap clothing. So potatoes then, the currency of the time. They exchanged them for, or they bartered them, if you like, for these luxuries: tobacco, snuff, soap, salt, herrings, and cheap clothing. Now, milk and meal were occasionally dispensed by the charitable, but money was very rarely given out. And when it was given, it was only in urban areas. Money was never given out to beggars in the countryside. Begging and vagrancy were a common and accepted feature of Irish life because the state welfare services and supports that we take for granted today did not exist in Ireland in the period before the Great Famine. Indeed, the very idea would have been anathema to the governing classes of the time on ideological grounds. The prevailing political and economic philosophy of the time, commonly known by the French phrase laissez-faire, let be. So the prevailing political and economic philosophy of the time was minimal state intervention in economic and social problems, minimal interference in citizens' lives. There was very little sympathy for the early 19th century poor, whom society divided into two broad classes, what they called the deserving and the undeserving poor. At the time, the poor were blamed for their own poverty. Society attributed poverty to idleness, intemperance, or other character defect, despite the fact that the primary agents of poverty in the 19th century were meagre and insufficient earnings, irregular employment, large families, sickness, old age, and bereavement. These were the realities, but society chose to blame the poor for their own poverty. There was some character defect, there was some moral defect in their own personages. They were either idle or drunken or whatever. Now, despite this philosophy of non-interference in the part of governments, the problem of poverty was so acute in Ireland by the 1830s that the government was forced to intervene. And in 1833, it appointed a royal commission to inquire into the condition of the poorer classes in Ireland. This is the so-called Poor Inquiry. It was conducted over a 3-year period, from 1833 to 1836, and it was the most extensive survey of poverty that was ever undertaken in either Britain or Ireland. This Poor Inquiry was concerned with 7 main categories of individuals. The first, deserted and orphaned children. Secondly, illegitimate children and their mothers. Thirdly, widows with young children. The next one, the impotent, or the helpless poor who were incapable of providing for themselves through age because they were old and because they were infirm. The sick poor, people who were capable of providing for themselves when healthy. And finally, penultimately, the healthy people, able-bodied, who were out of work. And finally, mendicants and vagrants. Now, if you think of the 2 broad categories, deserving and undeserving poor, where do these different groups fit in? Deserted and orphan children. Deserving, I mean, nobody would quibble with that. Illegitimate children.